Story 1. I support helping lower-income individuals, but this seems like an arbitrary way to provide that support. Why should the person who delivers my pizza receive a tax break, but not the person who delivers my Amazon package? It would be better to update the tax brackets to offer a tax break to all lower-income individuals instead of a gimmicky solution like this. Story 2. If it is not taxed, it is not recognized for unemployment and Social Security benefits. Let's give an example. John, a waiter, makes $3.50 per hour plus tips. At the end of the week, he earns $140 in wages and $800 in tips. If he gets injured at work or is laid off, workers' compensation or unemployment benefits will be half of $140, which is $70 per week. If tips are taxed, workers' compensation will be half of $940, resulting in $470 per week. For Social Security, retirement benefits will be based on taxed income only, which in this case is $140 per week. Thread carefully about this. Not taxing overtime will have the same implications. In my opinion, overtime should be minimal, and the taxes on overtime should be paid by the company itself. Too many workers rely on overtime to make ends meet. Story 3. This approach increases the complexity of taxes and encourages tipping instead of straightforward salaries or hourly rates for services. As a policy, it would promote fraud by misclassifying income as tips or overtime. If the goal is to lower tax rates for low-income service workers, simply reduce the tax rates for the first few income brackets. Story 4. Any system created without addressing the root cause will be exploited by the underlying issue. Story 5. It is a political distraction. We are discussing not taxing tips while they are considering not taxing capital gains or estates behind closed doors. Stop falling for it. Story 6. It's income, isn't it? If I work and make $60,000, why should a tipped worker who makes $60,000 pay less in taxes than I do? Income is income, no matter where it comes from. Story 7. I believe it would be beneficial if most of my income were not taxed. A targeted tax cut for a specific group of people does not seem like good policy. Is there a shortage of hospitality workers that we are trying to incentivize people to fill? Story 8. It is a bad idea. Someone who earns a $50,000 fixed salary should not pay more taxes than someone with $50,000 in tipped income or someone with a $30,000 salary and $20,000 in overtime. People should be taxed on their total income, regardless of how it is categorized. This also opens the door to various forms of fraud, as individuals may label other income as tips or overtime. Story 9. Complete red herring. Tax the wealthy. Pay a living wage and eliminate tipping. I do not recall the specifics, but the overtime issue is a misdirection that will primarily benefit the companies. Story 10. This would further incentivize owners to avoid paying staff and rely on tips. People should receive a fair wage for the labor they provide. It doesn't make sense to give tax incentives for not paying a wage while penalizing lower-income individuals who rely on wages. Story 11. I do not agree with it. I work full-time and pay taxes on my entire compensation. Why should an employee not pay taxes on the money they earn? I must say, though, I am a little surprised that many people agree with this, even though most individuals will not benefit from it. Story 12. There will be increasing pressure on low wages and high tips, benefiting business owners who hope their staff can receive tips from customers. Overtime will become necessary for staff to earn a living, which is not a healthy situation. A better approach is to provide a decent wage where tips are not needed, along with proper taxation. Story 13. If the tax on tips goes away, I will no longer be tipping. The simple reason is that I do not want my income taxed for someone else to avoid taxation. Is it bad form? Absolutely. Will I still eat out? Probably not. This will have a double impact. At the end of the day, it is the responsibility of businesses to pay their workers and ensure their income is taxed. If we are all equal, though that seems unlikely, we should be treated equally. Ultimately, former President Trump advocated for this, but the Republicans in Congress are not passing it, making it just another distraction. Story 14. I think it is a gimmick. It was an attempt to get working-class voters excited about Donald Trump, despite the rest of his agenda being explicitly anti-working class. The phrase "no tax on tips or overtime" sounds better than reduced tax rates for everyone making less than a specified amount per year, even though the latter is an easier policy to implement and would benefit more people. Story 15. Why does a minimum wage worker have a higher tax than a tipped worker making the same amount? If you earn it, pay your share. Story 16. Empty promises aim to deceive service workers. You will also see many frustrated workers in other sectors. Why should someone who works in a factory or an office have to pay taxes while a restaurant worker or taxi driver does not? Story 17. I think the only thing that happens is that the overtime gets taxed as straight time. For instance, if you receive time and a half for overtime hours, the extra half time would not be taxed. It seems like an accounting nightmare, though. Story 18. You know what would help with that and negate the concept of tips and overtime altogether? A livable wage, regulated growth without it being driven by greedy shareholders, and maybe decent healthcare. This is akin to saying thank you for 50 cents when they raised the rent by $500, which is what is happening with tax cuts for the wealthy by burdening the middle class. Story 19. Why would we not tax overtime? Tips can be understood since they can be considered a gift rather than a wage, although that is a stretch. The solution is simple. Tax all forms of income appropriately, with much lower percentages for low-wage earners and much higher percentages for high-wage earners. Otherwise, we end up endlessly debating which income should or should not be taxed. Gambling winnings, lottery prizes, stock gains, and side hustles all raise similar questions. It seems we should either apply tax to all income or to none. Story 20. It will create a strong incentive for tips-only positions under the pretense that there is no income tax. But there will be no guarantee of any salary. Employees are likely to accept this. There also appear to be significant opportunities for employers to abuse this system by skimming or withholding tips and engaging in money laundering. Ultimately, this is all just fiction. There is nothing about it in the budget. Story 21. The government wants to reduce the deficit by billions. However, they are cutting off a source of income. Story 22. To be honest, I currently tip 20 to 25% knowing that the server has to pay taxes. This may lead me to tip 10 to 15% again. Story 23. I would prefer if we stopped providing tips and ensured that people received a stable, livable wage. I would also favor practices that do not incentivize overtime. Story 24. Just eliminate the loophole that allows employers to pay tipped employees less than the minimum wage. Story 25. With the increasing pressure on tipping culture, this is similar to a vacation rental listing for $175 per night with a $400 cleaning fee. Businesses should be transparent about pricing and compensate their employees upfront instead of pressuring customers afterward. It is also better for employees, as their pay should not depend on the whims of customers in most industries. Story 26. How about we end tipping and raise the minimum wage so people can live on regular pay instead of relying on overtime? Story 27. If they are not going to tax tips, I will tip less. If they are not going to pay tax on it, then I will reap the benefits. So I am fine with it. Story 28. If it is anything like the proposed bill currently in Congress, the title of the bill sounds appealing until you read the limitations. All income is fully taxed if the individual has an adjusted gross income of $100,000 or, for a married couple, $200,000, creating a cliff effect. The deduction is only for overtime compensation, provided it does not exceed 20% of the individual's other wages from the same employer for the taxable year. So, if you are a food service worker making $20 per hour and working 2,000 hours a year, that amounts to $40,000. If you receive more than $8,000 in tips, you will be taxed as usual on any amount over $8,000. If you are an hourly worker working 40 hours per week and accumulate more than 5 hours and 20 minutes of overtime in a week, there will be no deduction for any overtime beyond that limit. Story 29. I believe it is a marketing strategy to distract from what matters. Tips should not be what they are today, and overtime should not be something that is heavily relied upon. Restaurants should not depend on customers to pay staff salaries through tips. Overall, businesses should keep up with the cost of living. Again, this argument serves only to distract the public from our real issues. Story 30. The idea effectively attracted voters. My coworkers are confident that our overtime will not be taxed. They do not consider that the definition of overtime may change, and the standard 40-hour workweek may be eliminated as well if they proceed with the Project 2025 plan. Story 31. It is more of a publicity stunt to appeal to working-class voters than anything else. I believe we need tax bracket reform across the board, regardless of whether that income is from tips or salary. Story 32. It likely has more unintended consequences than we realize. Some wealthy individuals may classify portions of their income as tips to avoid taxes. While tipped workers in a certain income bracket will receive a tax break, employees with similar income who do not receive tips will not receive that tax break. It does not seem fair. If two people both make $60,000 a year, they should be taxed similarly, regardless of one relying on tips and the other not. Story 33. I do not think anyone working over 40 hours a week should be taxed on any earnings after the 40-hour mark. You are doing more than necessary, so you should be rewarded for trying to improve yourself and your life. Story 34. I think it's a strange talking point that conservatives are emphasizing, but ultimately it doesn't matter. Conservatives have no values. They don't care about taxing tips or overtime. At some point someone realized, we have no positive things to say about our own policies. It's literally just all the things we dislike and want to eliminate. We should come up with something positive so supporters can repeat at least one thing that isn't just arbitrary negativity. This was the idea they developed. If you work for tips or earn overtime, being taxed on that income isn't going to make or break you. If you genuinely believe Republicans when they say they will do anything that might benefit you, then I think you are mistaken. Story 35. This is incredibly misguided. My degree is in economics, and I have spent a lot of time studying labor economics. When the government implements policies like this, it results in numerous distortions in the labor market. What is the rationale for not taxing gratuities, for instance? Aren't they income just like regular wages? If the entire tipped services industry is flawed, you cannot resolve it by introducing tax incentives to expand it. Overtime is generally paid at 1.5 times the regular rate. What is the rationale for this? I could understand not taxing it if you are only being compensated at the regular rate. However, that would disrupt the system as employers would reduce overtime pay because it remains tax-exempt. All of this is a mess. Story 36. It's a significant fraud scheme. Everyone in management will be on overtime or receiving tips for most of their income. Additionally, why is their pay taxed at a lower rate than mine? I am an educated and licensed professional. Is my work less valuable because of this? Story 37. This will not actually happen. It was promised on the campaign trail but not in the budget they proposed. If it did happen, it would be badly abused. Pay by tips rather than appropriate pay is a bad model. Story 38. It is a distraction that diverts attention from real issues and creates an opportunity for individuals with high incomes to exploit for their own benefit. Story 39. How about we eliminate the tipping culture and pass a law that states employees cannot be paid excessively low wages just because they receive tips? Story 40. Why should a tipped or overtime worker pay a penny less than another worker who earns the same amount? It is absurd. Story 41. It is a tactic to gain the votes of service jobs while not providing them with a fair wage. It serves as an excuse for owners to avoid paying their employees. Story 42. Given 50% of individuals with tips do not earn enough to submit federal taxes, it is only partially helpful. What we need to do is ensure that all employees receive minimum wage, even if tipped. For me, this policy was implemented to 1. Divide the working class. Allow most businesses in the United States to evade taxes by not paying the minimum wage. They can do this with as little as $30 a month in tips. Story 43. I'm okay with not taxing overtime. I'm not okay with not taxing tips. Most people who receive tips do not report the complete amount they receive. They often leave a lot out, mainly the tips that are left on cards. but they should have to pay taxes as well. Everyone else who works does, so they should contribute their fair share too. Story 44. I don't see the difference between delivering McDonald's and delivering Amazon packages. If the person delivering McDonald's receives tax-free income, then the Amazon driver should too. That doesn't answer your question. In my opinion, not taxing tips seems like a good start, but it's not the solution. Story 45. No tax on tips means I am not tipping. It is unfair that I have to pay tax on my minimum wage while they receive special treatment because they are serving food instead of stocking shelves. Story 46. It is absolutely unacceptable, and if it goes through, my tip percentage will drop to 0%, despite saving 15 to 20% on every meal I eat out. What defines our society is that we all contribute to it. It is unreasonable to suggest that certain jobs no longer need to pay income taxes on their earnings due to a flawed system that keeps employer-paid wages low and shifts that cost to consumers. Story 47. What would not taxing overtime do? It would make us want to work longer hours. I want to be paid a reasonable wage, not be told I can earn more if I work extra hours. People shouldn't desire to work over 40 hours. Even a 40-hour workweek isn't that great. This policy essentially incentivizes workers to work longer hours, which is not beneficial. Next, consider whether a waitress who makes $30 an hour in tips should be taxed differently than a fast food worker who makes $15 an hour in wages. Should the waitress be taxed more since she earns more? Tips are not gifts from customers. They are part of the worker's income. It is no different than the fact that when you purchase a meal, some of that price goes to the employees. Not taxing tips and overtime is poor policy. It seems businesses plan to exploit the lack of tax on tips while the overtime policy takes advantage of workers. If you want to support workers, consider raising the standard deduction or lowering taxes on lower income brackets. Instead, some politicians want to reduce corporate taxes. Story 48. Just a note for Americans. This is not currently in the proposed tax bill, despite what Trump is saying. Story 49. My opinion is that it is not included in the Budget Reconciliation Act approved by the House, and people are being misled about it. Story 50. I would prefer eliminating taxes on any income below $10,000, reducing the next tax bracket, and then reinstating tax brackets for progressive taxation with the top bracket at 90%. Many people did not realize that the 90% tax bracket does not exist so the government can claim all that money, which never happened. The purpose of that tax bracket is to encourage corporate profits to be reinvested back into the company and its growth instead of being siphoned off in the form of excessive bonuses for a select few. Before Reagan, we already had a functioning trickle-down economy. It was the Reagan tax cuts that broke that system and started the trend of money hoarding. Story 51. It's unfortunate because this situation will lead companies to do one of three things. They will eliminate overtime pay. Depending on where you work, employees often receive overtime pay or double pay when they exceed regular hours. This benefit is likely to be removed, which means you will probably earn less. They will enforce strict overtime policies, similar to my job, where they reduce hours during the week to ensure employees do not reach overtime. They will eliminate hourly wages and transition everyone to salary positions, ensuring that there is no opportunity for employees to earn overtime pay. Story 52. I'm not a fan of cutting social service programs for those in need, which may occur if there isn't enough money collected in taxes. Suggesting not taxing tips and overtime was a way to appeal to lower income brackets, so they wouldn't question tax breaks for higher income earners. Tax tips, tax overtime, and tax the wealthy. Fully fund social service programs. Story 53. Well, at first glance, it would seem to benefit the worker. I'm sure it would benefit some people, including business professionals. For workers who receive tips and can now keep more of their earnings, a business case can be made that there is less need to increase the base wage for those individuals since they have effectively received a pay increase. When it comes to tax-free overtime, more workers might be willing to work extra hours. This could lead to more income for those working overtime. It is also advantageous for employers, since they may not need to hire additional staff. There are two sides to every story. Story 54. We need a more uniform tax code, not one with more complications. I do not understand the point of this step. Taxation should be based on what individuals earn. It does not matter if income comes from tips, overtime, or a standard 40-hour workweek. Why are people who make $60,000 a year being taxed differently? Story 55. It is silly. It is a way of trying to make it seem like you are advocating for the working class when, in reality, you are pandering. Just raise taxes on the upper income and lower them on the lower income. Additionally, create a new tax bracket for the very wealthy and reduce the rates on the lower tax bracket. Story 56. I think it was a catchy bait and switch to deceive people into voting for the emperor with spray tan. Meanwhile, neither of these things are in the Republican agenda or budget. Story 57. Overtime should be taxed less. People working overtime are usually doing so out of necessity, not luxury. Story 58. It is a flawed concept, in my opinion, that unfairly impacts every white-collar salaried worker in the country. Luckily, as far as I am aware, it is not included in the budget submitted by the Republicans. Story 59. If you receive more than a specific amount of money per pay period in tips, you are considered a tipped employee, and your minimum wage may be significantly lower, sometimes around $2 or $3 an hour. The amount varies by state. This system allows businesses to pay employees less, which can lead to abuse. Additionally, it is important to acknowledge the concern that removing taxed wages negatively impacts individuals' eligibility for unemployment benefits, Social Security, and Medicare. This may be a primary motivation for businesses, with the reduced wages for employees being an unintended consequence. Story 60. How about we abolish the minimum wage and then raise minimum wage instead? Then we wouldn't need to rely on tips as much. Story 61. They want us to work more. Why don't they just give us decent pay with regular hours or reduce our workload? I have been working overtime for over a decade at hospitals, and the corporate management never has its act together. It is much cheaper to slightly overwork an employee than to do the right thing and hire two people. All I want is to work normal hours, cook dinner, spend time with my family and kids, and not live in poverty when I retire. Story 62. My thought is that we should eliminate our tipping culture and pay employees a livable wage. If every other country on Earth survives, and in many cases thrives, without tips, we can too. Story 63. Any opportunity to avoid taxation should be embraced, especially for that particular sector of workers. Story 64. It is a great idea that is more complex than it sounds. There are easier ways to address the tipping problem. John Oliver recently released a video on this. Story 65. Trump is promising most people nothing. Most tipped employees do not report cash tips, and even if they did, they do not make enough money to pay income tax. This will mainly affect high earners who make a significant amount of money in tips or people whose employer can change their bonuses to tips somehow. Overtime sounds great. It would be beneficial, but they are also planning to make it much harder to claim overtime. The end result is that if you do not have a union, a lot of your overtime will be paid normally, and you will pay taxes on it. Story 66. I work for tips, and it seems like my job will be positively affected by this. However, it likely won't be by that much. Cash tip? What cash tip? Meanwhile, the randomness of this change will likely benefit higher-income individuals who can restructure their pay to be considered tips. It always felt like a superficial change meant to sound appealing to those who are not fully informed. Now that it's here, it still feels that way. Story 67. I believe that all income should be taxed. Cash tips often go unreported and are essentially not taxed. Additionally, it seems unfair that the entire income of back-of-house staff is taxed while front-of-house staff, who often earn more, do not have to pay income tax on their earnings. Regarding overtime, what exactly is the definition? I am able to charge for straight time, meaning I get paid for every hour I work, but I do not receive time and a half pay. Does this qualify as overtime, or is overtime only considered time and a half? Furthermore, there is also the issue of revenue loss. Overall, I do not think this is a good idea. Story 68. That will never happen. There would be too many loopholes for people to cheat on their taxes and attempt to reclassify themselves as non-exempt employees, changing their full-time requirement to 30 hours a week, with the rest classified as overtime. Additionally, this is a campaign promise of Donald J. Trump that would help the common people, and he rarely follows through on such policies without some sort of negative consequence, as seen when they passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. Story 69. It's unwise. As an economist, certified public accountant, and sensible person, this creates more loopholes than the soon-to-be smaller Internal Revenue Service can handle. It is grossly unfair to salaried individuals who work extra hours without additional pay and pay tax on 100% of their wages. This also ignores the increased spending deficit. I am amazed at the unintended positive outcomes that are working out in our favor, such as Mexico tightening border security, Canada cracking down on drug trafficking into the United States, and Europe being compelled to cover their share of defense costs for Ukraine. Story 70. Tips. There are two critical factors for me. First, the Supreme Court recently ruled that payments to public officials in exchange for favors are acceptable as long as they are categorized as tips after the completion of the favor. Apparently, it is only considered a bribe if payment is exchanged beforehand. Part of their reasoning was based on the assumption of transparency, as tips are taxable income, meaning there would be a record of the payments. If they were not reported, the official could be prosecuted for tax fraud. It was only after that ruling that the No Tax on Tips campaign promise was launched. Second, immediately after the campaign promise was made, there was discussion about restructuring corporate pay structures to incorporate tips into compensation packages instead of bonuses. I am strongly opposed to exempting tips from taxation unless there are very strict definitions of what constitutes a tip that explicitly exclude potential abuses. Over time, it unfairly penalizes salaried employees who are already not compensated for their extra work. However, if it were linked with changes to compensation structures that eliminate the distinctions between hourly and salaried employees and allow people to be paid for the actual hours they work, I would not oppose it. Story 71. I would love for my overtime to be tax-free. I believe the taxes on my first 80 hours of work are sufficient, and anything beyond that is a personal choice to invest more of my time beyond contractual obligations. Since that extra work is voluntary, I should be entitled to keep those earnings tax-free. Story 72. I believe that if tips were exempt from taxes, there would quickly be a shift in attitude regarding the question of why individuals should pay tax on their income and then give additional money to those who do not pay any taxes. This change could potentially signal the beginning of the decline of tipping culture in the United States. Story 73. I have to pay taxes on my income, and they are already affecting the system by not reporting cash tips. I will reduce my tips to a maximum of 15%. Story 74. It doesn't matter either way. People are not paying taxes on cash tips as it is. They can say that it's legal now, but the effect is the same. Story 75. Any incremental fixes for problems, no matter how big or small, should be viewed as a positive development. These fixes will not address our larger issues with taxes. Additionally, regarding anything Trump says, 1. I will believe it when I see it. We should wait and judge what the actual final proposal looks like. Story 76. Architects would lay out sidewalks in universities as they thought they needed to be, but were surprised when the students did not use them and instead cut their own paths through the grass lawns. Then one university set up new buildings but did not install most of the sidewalks. A year later, they installed sidewalks exactly where the students had created pathways in the ground, and the new sidewalks were all used. I feel this issue with the taxation on tips is similar. Nobody is paying income tax on those tips, so why continue trying to collect it and simultaneously make the workers feel like criminals? Removing the requirement for them to pay tax would solve the problem. Plus, they are the last people who deserve to be paying taxes. Story 77. I support reducing taxes for lower income brackets, but how is this structured? Does this mean someone working at a 5-star restaurant earning $150,000 in tips annually, rare, but possible in big cities, will not have to pay any tax? What qualifies as overtime? What about on-call time? What about weekend time? In my experience, cash tips are often not accurately reported. Why not include teachers? Why not include nurses? Why not include sanitation workers? This approach seems arbitrary and unhelpful overall. Story 78. Sorry, but I am not in favor. I would rather we close the tax loopholes and cut taxes for the lower brackets. Income is income and should be taxed as income. This should also apply to realized capital gains. Story 79. No tax on tips means no retirement savings, Social Security, or unemployment insurance on tips, which negatively impacts workers and benefits the government and employers financially. We should eliminate tips and increase wages while lowering the tax burden on the lower working class who earn minimum wages and rely on tips. It is disingenuous to make a populist appeal with a trendy slogan that sounds good but is fundamentally flawed. No tax on tips might work as a catchy phrase, but raise wages for workers and abolish tips is less marketable. They will likely combine the no tax on tips proposal with a bill that provides substantial tax breaks for the wealthy, which the middle class will ultimately have to subsidize. Story 80. If you want to give working class people a tax break, do that. However, I do not understand why we would tax a waiter at a lower rate than a cashier. The discrepancy makes no sense and seems like a loophole that is ripe for exploitation. Story 81. Show me a definition of tips and overtime that doesn't allow for abuse, waste, and fraud, and maybe I might agree, provided that it's also not considered artificial general intelligence for benefits. Story 82. As a salaried employee who works 60 to 80 hours a week regularly, I want to know the definition of overtime here. Story 83. No tax on tips is like giving a bottle of water to someone who is on fire. It is not nearly as effective as intended. There are many other options that would be far better, such as eliminating the subminimum wage nationwide. Story 84. All forms of income and compensation should be taxed equally, whether it is an hourly wage, tip, capital gains, benefits, or stock options. All income should be combined at tax time, and taxes should be applied accordingly, whether at 0%, a flat rate, or based on tax brackets. It simply needs to be done equally. Story 85. Taxation should be based on a simple principle. If you earn more money, you pay more taxes. It is irrelevant how that money was earned, and any cuts should prioritize lower earners first, as they require more assistance and will reinvest more of their income back into local economies. Most tips go unreported or underreported, so this is unlikely to significantly impact service staff. The biggest beneficiaries will be those working overtime. However, I believe overtime should not be favored by the government in any particular way. Consider a person who works 50 hours a week at one job versus someone who works 30 hours at one job and has a second job for 20 hours at the same pay. These individuals are otherwise identical. The first worker earns more from the employer by working overtime. This odd exemption means that, despite working the same amount, the lower-paid worker ends up paying more taxes than the higher earner. That is, frankly, misguided. Furthermore, this issue becomes more complicated when considering which income groups are likely to have a single job with overtime versus those who are more likely to work multiple part-time jobs. Story 86. Quick reminder. In the 2024 case Snyder versus United States, the United States Supreme Court ruled that federal bribery law does not apply to gifts given after an official act. This means that the law does not apply to tips or gratuities. So now your tip is no longer taxable. Story 87. This is Reddit. You will not get a truthful answer from over 99% of the users with your question phrased as it is. To get an accurate response, you would need to ask, what are your thoughts on Democrats proposing not taxing tips and overtime? As it stands, the proposal is associated with Republicans. Therefore, the majority of respondents will likely be adamantly against it, often providing absurd answers such as suggesting that presidents, CEOs, CFOs, and executives could write contracts stating your salary is $1, but they will pay you $1 million in tips. They have no understanding of what defines overtime, but that makes no difference. They dislike anything suggested by a Republican, even when it may benefit them or primarily assist the middle and lower income classes. Quite honestly, if you asked, a Republican-controlled business just developed a 100% effective treatment for brain cancer, and your child has brain cancer that will kill him or her in 6 weeks. Would you accept the treatment? The majority of Reddit users would say no and let their child die. Story 88. Won't make a significant difference to the United States economy. but will greatly impact those who depend on tips and overtime. Story 89. Tips should not be a supplemental form of income. Restaurants should be required to pay their workers a living wage, just like any other business. Story 90. This is a Trojan horse. While it works for the average person, the tips that the US leader is advocating for allow CEOs to claim their bonuses as tips. This way, when they receive an extra million or whatever their tip is, they won't have to pay taxes on it. Story 91. Bad idea. Supports exploiters. Taxes are beneficial. However, when those who profit from the labor of others do not pay taxes, it creates negative consequences. Story 92. Tips should be highly taxed so that, hopefully, service industry workers will wake up and demand that their employers pay them instead of relying on the generosity of customers. Story 93. It's his way of giving a little to regular people so he can give a lot to wealthy individuals. However, the benefits for regular people are very minimal. Many tips go untaxed when they are cash. If a person who works solely for tips wants to buy a house, they need to prove their income, which is usually when they start claiming their tips. How will this new system work? Also, the tipping system is problematic from the start. As consumers, we are already subsidizing poor business practices. Tips should not deviate from the norm, and any tip thereafter should be untaxed. There should be no tax on overtime. However, most people I know don't receive any overtime offers. What people really need is less tax on their regular income. Why is the solution for working-class individuals to work more than 40 hours per week? 40 hours is considered full-time and consumes a significant portion of one's life. This change will mainly benefit businesses that offer overtime, convincing employees that it is beneficial for them. Suddenly, your regular work week becomes 50 to 60 hours. What do the ultra-wealthy gain from this tax scheme? Nothing. They don't punch a clock or work overtime. They receive tax breaks on their existing income. I support the idea of no tax on Social Security. Most elderly individuals relying solely on Social Security clearly need any extra support they can get. Story 94. Income tax is already significant. Overtime and tips should be tax-free. If you have paid taxes on 40 hours of work, you have more than contributed your share. Story 95. It is not effective. We tax income, which is still income. Creating additional special exemptions does not provide a solution. Presenting this minor issue as a success is merely a distraction. Story 96. It is an impractical idea. It creates opportunities for fraud and other loopholes, which I expect would be a primary concern if implemented. Not taxing overtime or tips means they are not considered for benefits like Social Security. This approach encourages employers to maintain lower wages, forcing workers to depend on overtime and tips. It disproportionately advantages workers who receive tips or overtime, while simply lowering income tax or increasing tax credits for all low-income workers would benefit individuals in all jobs. Story 97. I can't wait for someone to find a loophole in the overtime rule. Start a company, pay yourself a small hourly rate, but have 10 times the overtime pay, and log an additional 20 hours a week of overtime. That's free money with minimal taxes. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.